why am I not a Buddhist? For some of you, the question might be, why was I ever a Buddhist? Or why would I now say that I'm an ex-Buddhist, as opposed to saying that I never was a Buddhist? I was involved with Buddhist studies, Buddhist-related research for 12 years of my life, big percentage of my adult life. And to start with a parable, I guess, I remember hearing on the radio in Canada many years ago, about 15 years ago, a complaint from a Christian minister about the derision and contempt he was regarded with in Canada, just as he went grocery shopping and went about his daily business. At that time, there were scandals in the newspapers about both Catholic and Protestant priests and ministers and so on. And I remember he specifically said that, he couldn't smile at or wave at a child without people looking at him sheepishly or asking, what's that guy's problem? This kind of thing. Now, that minister, from his perspective, when he puts on a uniform, he expects to get more reverence, more respect than some stranger you know nothing about. He thinks he's clothing himself with something that raises his status. And I would guess many medical doctors have the same expectation when they put on a lab coat with a name tag, and many other professions as well. Even though we know rationally a medical doctor can be a terrible person, obviously a priest can be a terrible person, and so on. But it doesn't enter into the priest's mind that when you live in a country where the vast majority of people are not Christian, you're clothing yourself in the legacy of genocide, slavery, of racism within the church, and of course, recent sexual abuse scandals. You're clothing yourself in something that's odious, and that's only justified by, an appeal to supernatural things that fewer and fewer people now believe in. However, the other meditation that comes out of that is the fact that many people who, when they meet that priest, are suspicious or apprehensive, who don't have a positive response to seeing the man in uniform, many of those people still have a positive idea of Christianity, still have some kind of religious connection to an abstract God, or still pray, or still want to believe in something. With Buddhism, I had to recognize at a certain point that when I met someone who was a Buddhist monk, I didn't assume good things about them anymore. On the contrary, I had so much experience that when I met someone who was wearing the robes, instead you'd have apprehensions and very negative expectations, and would wonder, what's his story? Once in a while you meet a monk and you find out who they are, and you find out there are some things you can respect about them. However, when you know the state of Buddhist monasticism in the 21st century, you know that if you meet a complete stranger on the street, dressed in a nondescript way, you may expect the best, you may expect the worst. You have no expectations either way compared to the rest of humanity. But yeah, when you meet someone who is a Buddhist monk, what they're clothed in, for me, as someone who became an expert on Buddhism in 12 years, is actually very, very negative. So as soon as I could recognize that, I can recognize that not only is it the case that I'm not a Buddhist, but that I don't want to be a Buddhist. I don't want to be called or referred to as a Buddhist. You can look up an interview I gave to a magazine in Hong Kong, a Buddhist magazine, in which I do refer to myself as Buddhist. I'll provide the link at the bottom of this YouTube video. So I have called myself a Buddhist in the past, and I can remember other people trying to denounce me by claiming that I was not a Buddhist, and I would be able to turn around and say, look, this is what I've accomplished in the past years, this is what I've devoted my life to. What grounds do you have for saying I'm not a Buddhist? When very often the people saying this, they themselves had no scholarly knowledge of Buddhism. They had not done anything, they had not accomplished anything in their life that proved any kind of commitment to or interest in the religion. Now, Buddhism, perhaps, well, more than some religions, it's entirely possible to be a Buddhist and not believe in anything supernatural. It is true, I never believed in magic. I never believed that when you die, you went to meet King Yama in hell. And it's the same King Yama in the ancient Pali Canon that you see in the modern cartoon Dragon Ball Z. It's the same mythology. Different artists have interpreted it in different ways, of course, over the centuries. No, in that sense, I never did. But what I believed in that was more compelling to me was that my engagement with Buddhism was part of me making a positive difference in the world. And I'd like to think that's what motivates someone to be a scholar of Socrates or Thucydides or any other ancient philosopher that may not be considered religious today, or that may be a religious philosopher. And what made Theravada Buddhism so dynamic was the mix of humanitarian work and field research that it offered me. That there was the modern disaster of places like Cambodia and Laos, the intersection of political and philosophical concerns, ancient history and modern history, and indeed ancient languages and modern languages, all mixed up at the same point. But there's a very sad sequel to the first image I used. The fact that when I meet a Buddhist monk, I don't consider them a good person. I don't have positive expectations. That I'm apprehensive, knowing what I know, and many other Buddhists, sadly, are the same way. And that is that in 12 years, I met many of the leading figures in the field face to face, and there are many others whose work I've read and who have talked to me by email. This being the 21st century. And there's not a single scholar in the game that I respect, not even one. And the level of intellectual dishonesty and fraud, outright fraud, that exists in the academic study of Buddhism, that was something that continued to disappoint me no matter how low my expectations were. So, when I say now that I'm an ex-Buddhist, that's because in the past, even though I didn't believe in magic, I did commit my life. I thought I would spend the rest of my life working on Pali and its connection to modern Southeast Asian languages, including Lao, Cambodian, etc. And I thought I would dedicate my life partly to dragging some of the most interesting philosophy out of those ancient texts and making it available to the public, and also being involved in, which I was involved in, being involved in the humanitarian concerns as those countries variously emerge from post-war, post-communist disasters and undergo a period of cultural and economic transformation. Positive side of the story is that I did accomplish really everything I wanted to accomplish. I was able to live in those countries for a number of years. I was able to work on those languages. I was able to teach myself Pali to a level where I could really read philosophy in the original source. And I had a diverse and very educational experience though during those years. Very, very hard life, financially and materially, and cope with very tough circumstances. But when people ask me, and they do sometimes ask me, why don't you go back to Cambodia now? Why don't you continue to work in these places? One reason is that I've already done just about everything I set out to do. That's the positive reason. And the negative reason is what I've already mentioned, that there's really no further I can go with it because of the absence of any colleagues that I respect, the absence of any institutions I respect. And I get fan mail all the time. Still today I get fan mail. I got more in the past when I was more active on the internet. And normally the first question people want to ask is, wow, this is great. You know, give me your recommended reading list. Whose book should I read? And what's the best place to study? And what are the best institutions? And, you know, in terms of living authors and so on, there's really nothing I can recommend. And instead, you know, when people write back to me with enthusiasm with some book, I have to say, no, I'm sorry to warn you, but this translator is intentionally misleading in these ways. This author is misleading in these ways. It's really reached a remarkably low ebb in 2014. So, you know, that's the negative side of it. I mean, I've been all over the world with this Buddhist thing. I spoke once with a monk who I have some respect for, to give a positive example of a monk. He was a guy who was dragged out of one country after another as a refugee. And his temple was burned down by Muslims. He was attacked and beaten by Muslims. His followers were too. He was a victim of anti-Buddhist Muslim violence, which is a huge issue that you can't read about much in the mainstream press, but that's a story of 1,000 years that's still ongoing today. And you know, I remember he and I had a long conversation. He was very honest with me. Many monks are, because as a man with a shaved head who could read Pali and who really knew the texts, I had a kind of intermediary status halfway between monk and layperson. A lot of them were very honest with me. And at the end of the conversation, he sort of turned off the honesty, it seemed to me, and for a second just said, well, you know, everything in Buddhism is getting better and better now. You know, it's flourishing here in the West, and you know, it's flourishing in various countries in Asia. And that was such a striking contrast to the conversation he and I had been having up until that moment. We were both talking about our experiences in Southeast Asia and around the world. And I just said to him, you know, I'm sorry, but you know, I don't believe you. I don't think even you believe that. I think you know that Buddhism is collapsing in China. Buddhism is collapsing in Tibet. Buddhism is collapsing in Sri Lanka. Buddhism is collapsing in Thailand, and so on. And in the Western world, there's much less legitimate scholarship of Buddhism going on now than there was 100 years ago. Virtually zero. And there's certainly basically zero legitimate religious or monastic Buddhism in the West. There's a lot of fraud, a lot of scams, but nothing to hold up as a positive.